Welcome to Overnight Wisdom, a show where we sit with change makers, artists, business leaders, and thinkers. Each conversation is an invitation to slow down, to go deeper, and unearth the quiet insights that shape who we are. If you're seeking honest reflections, unexpected wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what it takes to not merely survive, but to thrive, you're in the right place. Leadership isn't a role, it's a responsibility. And responsibility requires clarity. Not just vision board clarity, but clarity about who you are, where you are, and what you actually have the power to move. In this episode, I'm breaking down the 3 kinds of clarity every leader needs: identity clarity, context clarity, and power clarity. Because without them, leadership becomes performative. Teams get confused, culture erodes, and the cost isn't just burnout, it's trust. This is a framework I've built over 10 years of working with leaders and organizations across the world, and I'm sharing it with you, raw, direct, and reflective. Whether you lead 2 people or 2,000, this episode is for you. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, it's Chisom, and today I'm going to be chatting with you about leadership. I really want to talk about the 3 forms of clarity that every leader needs. These 3 clarities determine whether a leader moves with coherence or fragmentation. When a leader lacks even one of them, decision-making can be reactive, inconsistent, and heavy. But when they're all present, leadership becomes grounded, it becomes directional, and it becomes trustworthy. So what exactly am I talking about? I am talking about 3 types of clarity: identity clarity, context clarity, and power clarity. Identity clarity is essentially that clarity about who you are. So who am I? Identity clarity is the anchor of leadership. It is the internal knowing that shapes presence, behavior, and direction. A leader with identity clarity understands who they are in the role that they're in, what their values are, so what they stand on, what they will not trade for approval, for comfort, for ease, what principles guide their decision making, and how they show up even under pressure. Without identity clarity, leaders tend to shapeshift. They become who they think their board wants to see, who they think the executive leadership team wants to see, or their team wants to see, or who the systems actually rewards. And this becomes the origin of performative leadership, because when identity is unstable, confidence becomes very performative and decisions become reactive depending on where the wind blows. So identity clarity is so important to leadership because it makes leadership steady. So to provide a bit more context, when we talk about things like who are you in the role that you're in, it's important to clarify for yourself who you are in your specific role, not in your previous organization, not in your previous country, not who you want to become, who you are now with this team in this context. That is going to be very important for clarifying to yourself what your identity is within the role that you hold. You can also reflect on what you stand on in terms of what are the principles that are non-negotiable for you, what are the things that you would defend no matter what. You can also reflect on the things you will not trade for approval, for comfort, for ease, and what line you won't cross, even when everyone else might. When we talk about how you show up under pressure, it's not how you hope to show up, it's how you actually show up when the stakes are high, and also on short time constraints, because it's quite easy to make better decisions or to show up better when you have more time to reflect and think, but also clarifying to yourself, who am I under pressure? How do I show up under pressure? There are costs to unclear identity. So when leaders lack identity clarity, the organization pays in 3 ways. First, decisions become inconsistent. So what that means is that the team cannot predict what a leader would prioritize. So they start gaming the system. Essentially, it becomes politics. A second way the organization pays is that trust erodes. Oftentimes quietly, people start to distrust the character of a leader. They distrust your consistency. They distrust your ability to do the things you say you would do because they're not quite sure what leader they will get tomorrow. And when trust begins to erode organizationally, it's really not good for morale, it's not good for productivity, and it's not good for how people contribute to the workplace. And the third way it costs the organization is that you yourself will be exhausted, especially if every interaction you make requires recalculation. In this sense, you're not leading, you are literally performing leadership while watching yourself perform leadership. So here's a question to reflect on. If you removed your title as a leader, your organizational chart, your authority, and your budget, would people still do what you tell them to do? Would they still follow your direction? If you're not sure, then that is a good place to start because you need to start working on your identity clarity. Because clarity is not really about the power you hold, it's about who you are without that power. Leaders who have identity clarity are steady. They make decisions without performing them. They don't people please. Leaders disagree without defending themselves. They hold boundaries without over-explaining themselves or trying to appease other people. And at the same time, they recognize that their team will not always agree with them, but they know where they stand. And I think that clarity is important, that knowing where your leader stands, no matter what, reduces the mental gymnastics that a lot of people within their teams have to do. The next form of clarity I want to talk about is context clarity. Context clarity literally just asks, where am I? What context am I currently operating in? Context clarity is the ability to understand the ecosystem that you are operating in. And when I say understand the ecosystem, I mean thoroughly understand it. So think about it from a historical perspective, from a systemic perspective, from a cultural perspective, and from a political perspective. Leaders with context clarity, they know and they ask questions like, what forces shape this environment? What is the history here? What are the unspoken rules, the cultural pressures, the incentives? What patterns repeat themselves and why? What is rewarded and what is punished? How does this system respond to change? Leaders who ignore context try to apply generic leadership advice in environments that require precision. They repeat slogans like, we're flat, or let's be collaborative, or let's be agile, without understanding how the environment constrains or enables these behaviors. Context clarity prevents naive leadership. It turns good intentions into effective actions. Context clarity is what makes leadership intelligent. So here's how you should think about context clarity. Context clarity is the ability to read the system that you are operating in, not the system you wish you were in. It means asking, what is the real history here? Not the official story, the one people tell you after a few drinks. You know, what happened the last time someone tried to change things? What does the system reward, you know? Not what the value posters say, but who gets promoted? Who gets penalized? What are the unspoken rules? Is there a leader we do not challenge? If you challenge somebody, how does that go? Right? And who has the final say? Questions like, how does power actually flow? Not based on the organizational chart, just sometimes where people who do not have, say, the highest positional power exert significant influence. So really trying to understand, what does the map look like? Who influences decisions? Whose approval is required versus who is just ceremonial, you know? So who are the veto points? Something to keep in mind as leaders in understanding the context in which you operate in. And of course, thinking about what is the environment optimized for? Is it optimized for speed? Is it optimized for stability? Is it optimized for innovation or risk management? Into individual performance or systemic resilience. You can't change something you do not understand. You can't change what something is optimized for by wishing it were different. You get to know about it by knowing about it. Now, as a leader, when you have context clarity, you really just stop being naive. You don't import solutions from a previous company hoping that it will work here, because that it worked in company A doesn't mean it's going to work in this company. So you do not get to do that thing that essentially likely burns you out because you see that it's not effective within the context that you are operating in. So context clarity allows you to lead the organization you currently have rather than the one you wish you had. So again, like I said earlier, context clarity is what makes leadership intelligent. You can have perfect identity clarity. You can know exactly who you are and what you stand for. But if you do not know where you are, your clarity just makes you confidently wrong. Context clarity is a difference between principles and rigidity. It's the difference between conviction and naivety. It's the difference between vision and delusion. It's essentially what turns good leadership into effective leadership, because you know the grounds in which you are operating in. Now, I want to also clarify that context clarity is not the same thing as context acceptance. If you are in a toxic work environment, knowing that context does not necessarily mean accepting it. So one way to think about context clarity is it gives you 3 options. Option 1, you can work the margins, right? You can't change the core systems, but you can maybe create a little pocket of heaven for your team within your role. You can protect the people who report to you. You can create boundaries within your domain. But this only works when you have enough autonomy. The toxicity isn't life-threatening to you or others on your team, and you can create genuine value for the people in your scope, right? This would fail when the toxic context eventually bleeds in. If you don't really have the autonomy to create space and boundaries for how you work and how your team works. Another way to approach context clarity, especially within a toxic environment, is you can try to change it. But when you're trying to change it, you need to be fully aware of the cost, right? You cannot fight a system without understanding what it will cost you. So it's important to know the battles that are winnable. You know where power actually sits. You know what the system will tolerate and what will get you expelled. So you really also have to understand and play the system. You're not naive about it. You're going with basically your eyes open to a situation where you understand the cost, you understand the consequences, and you still choose to try to effect change. So this works when you have enough power, enough allies, and enough runway, and you're willing to pay the price, which might be your career, your reputation, your mental health, or years of your life. This fails when you underestimate the system's immune response to change, or you're fighting something that the system is designed to protect. So this would fail in this situation. And then a third option is to leave. Sometimes context clarity reveals that the system will not change in your lifetime, and staying in it would damage you. So it's not defeat, it's just strategic clarity. You leave not because you failed, but because you correctly diagnosed the cost of staying is higher than the cost of exit. Now, there is a privilege to being able to leave. Not all leaders have the capacity and the ability to leave whenever they want within the context that they work. This works when you have options, when you can leave without, something catastrophic happening and you value your integrity or your sanity more than your tenure. This feels in situations where you are running from every hard environment instead of learning to read context accurately. So if we look at the question, should I accept a toxic environment? Context clarity does not answer that question for you. Context clarity answers the question, if I stay, what am I actually signing up for? What can I realistically change? What will the system resist? And what will it cost me to try? Then you get to decide if it's worth it. And then the third type of clarity I want to talk about is power clarity. So power clarity looks at what can I influence here? It's knowing who you are, knowing the context in which you operate in, and then having that clarity in terms of the power you have to create any kind of change or make any kind of moves within that context. So power clarity is, I find, often misunderstood and, to be honest, the most avoided, especially by leaders who value equality. They often think that equality goes against concepts of power, that if you want power, you might not value equality. But power clarity actually requires understanding what decisions are yours, what influence do you have, what constraints are real, what levers can you move, how does your identity shape how your power is perceived, and when to use power for protection, for direction, for accountability, or for alignment. Without power clarity, leaders misuse power unintentionally. They become inconsistent, sometimes over-assertive, sometimes avoidant. They say things like, we're all equal here, while still holding veto authority. Unclear power creates politics. Unexamined power creates harm. Power clarity turns effort into impact. So what does power clarity actually look like? Leaders with power clarity, they don't apologize for having power. They use it cleanly. They say, this decision is mine. Here's how I'm thinking about it. I want your input, but I'm making the call. They can also say, this decision is yours. I trust you to make it. I'm here if you need me, but I'm not going to override you. Or they can say, this is collaborative. We'll decide together, and if we can't converge, here's how we'll break the tie. They don't perform equality. They create clarity about where power sits and how power moves. And that clarity does something that this collaboration theater never does. It just allows people to relax. People can finally breathe because they know what to expect. Their expectations are properly managed. So we've talked about identity clarity. You know who you are. We've talked about context clarity. You understand where you are. But if you do not know what you can actually move, you can spend years pushing on things that don't budge while ignoring the levers you actually control. So power clarity is what makes leadership efficient. It's the difference between good intentions and effective action, performative collaboration, and actual distributed authority. Asking for input and actually using it. Leaders without power clarity exhaust their team with false consultations. Leaders who have power clarity let their teams do their jobs. They get the right people for the role and they get out of their way. So how does this fit together? These three clarities, they form the backbone of coherent leadership. Identity clarity gives a leader an anchor. Context clarity gives them perspective. Power clarity gives them precision. When all three are aligned, you get coherence, which then produces capacity, better culture, and continuity. And this is how leadership becomes steady, directional, self-possessed, trusted, sustainable. So if you have leadership aspirations or you are a leader, it's important that you ask yourself these questions. Do you have identity clarity? Do you have context clarity? And do you have power clarity? And how are you continuing to introspect and ensuring that you are always acutely aware of the spaces that you're in and the power that you hold and how you are perceived within that space that you are in. So yes, this is my little chat on leadership. This is a research that I've been doing for the past 10 years, working with leaders at organizations across the world, but also learning from leaders at organizations across the world. So I will be sharing more about this over time, but this is a really good place to start to reflect for yourself what type of leader you are and how you might become better aware of who you are, where you are operating, and the type of power that you have. All right. Thank you for being here, and see you next week. Thank you for spending time with us on Overnight Wisdom. If this conversation moved you, inspired you, or made you pause, please leave a comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts, and if you're feeling generous, a rating or review goes a long way in helping others find us too. Until next time, stay curious, stay tender, and may the wisdom you need find you exactly when you're ready.